After World War II, the anticipated spread of nuclear weapons left many armies reeling to counter and exploit them.
Everyone kneel down in your foxholes, look down, and stay down.
Sometimes the tactics of warfare change. In nuclear explosions, the need for the wide dispersion of force has been indispensable to victory in war.
While today nuclear weapons are associated with Armageddon, there was a period of time when it was believed that some forms of nukes would become the ultimate form of artillery. This was both an opportunity, but also immensely dangerous to ground forces. Nuclear weapons pose specific challenges to the Marine Corps and its amphibious assault mission. Traditional assaults against well-prepared beach defenses required the massing of ships to achieve local superiority over the defender. But a mass of ships was a juicy target for a nuclear strike, as the US had been testing at its Bikini Atoll nuclear test site. While the Army made radical organizational changes, Marine thinking was rooted more in aviation and becoming painfully light. Today, I'm going in-depth with the experimental changes the Marines made to tackle nuclear warfare, what they had to backtrack on before deploying to Vietnam, and how they succeeded where the Army failed. Under the Eisenhower administration, the idea of massive retaliation threatened to make the US Army irrelevant. Massive retaliation said that even comparatively small conventional attacks from the Soviets could be countered with overwhelming nuclear force. This was to make up for NATO's conventional deficit versus the Soviets and hopefully deter conventional war altogether. No conventional war, no need for robust land armies. As a result of this doctrine, in the 1950s, the Air Force was at the tippy top of funding priorities because they were the nuclear deterrent, followed by the Navy, and then the Army at the very bottom. This pressured the Army to make radical changes with their Pentomic division to try and sell themselves in an unfriendly political environment. The Marine Corps, on the other hand, was much more secure in itself. It was part of the Navy, which was a higher funding priority, and the 1952 Douglas-Mansfield Act had set the Marine Corps structure as no less than 3 combat divisions and 3 air wings by law. The fact that the Marines didn't have to prove their worth allowed them to be more conservative in some ways, while being under the Department of the Navy allowed them to be innovative in others. It was believed that dispersion would be the main passive counter to nuclear weapons. If friendly forces are dispersed, no single area would be a worthwhile target, and if the enemy did waste a nuke on a dispersed unit, it would survive with most of its subunits intact. But dispersed units are weak on the attack and when defending against an attack. Combat power is too spread out, so units would have to be extremely mobile to reconcentrate. As early as 1946, the Marines got the inkling that the helicopter would be the answer to this problem. As the result of a special board headed by Major General Lemuel Shepard Jr., Marine Helicopter Experimental Squadron 1 was formed in December of 1947 to develop amphibious helicopter tactics. While capable ones did not yet exist, it was believed that concepts would drive their development. By contrast, around the same time, the new Air Force was telling the Army that helicopters were aerodynamically unsound and they didn't need any. The first manual on amphibious helicopter employment followed soon after, Fib 31, published in 1948. This manual praised the helicopter as providing the benefits of a conventional airborne attack while avoiding the scattering that paratroopers often suffered. Helicopters allowed assaults to be launched from escort carriers rather than land-based airfields, meaning they could occur basically anywhere near a coast. It was thought that vertical envelopment would allow Marines to bypass strong beach defenses, supplement slow ship-to-shore movements, and allow ships to remain dispersed during the initial assault wave to avoid presenting a nuclear target. It also opened up more coastline to landings, such as fjords where traditional amphibious assault would be costly. But a large-scale amphibious landing could not be carried out solely by air, so helicopter assault objectives would be in service of securing a beachhead to land follow-on forces and supply. Objectives could include dominant terrain overlooking the landing beaches or that allowed for their isolation, airfields, or enemy fires that threatened the invasion fleet. During the Korean War, the Marines' vision for helicopters during amphibious assault was not realized because of technical limitations, but helicopters were used tactically for troop carrying and other supporting functions. The Army also used helicopters during Korea, but they had definitely ceded thought leader status over the issue to the Marines for the time being. Through the early 1950s, it became widely accepted that the helicopter would be the Marines' answer to atomic warfare. The Commandant went so far as to approve an all-helicopter assault concept in 1954, and the Chief of Naval Operations agreed in principle the next year. After 8 years of planning and thousands of field tests, Landing Force Bulletin 17 was published. It called for a two-pronged attack. One, a vertical envelopment by helicopters launched from specially converted amphibious assault ships, and the other, a surface assault across the beach constituting the main effort. The ultimate long-term goal was the all-helicopter assault, where the beach itself would not have to be assaulted directly. Heavy follow-on forces and logistics would still have to be landed on the beach, but it was envisioned that technology would eventually allow for the assault waves to be carried by helicopter. However, the doctrine was predicated on tactical nuclear capabilities, and the landing force commander would need the authority to use them. Marine helicopter testing at the Desert Rock atomic blast exercises revealed some limitations that have to be mitigated, such as changes in wind causing unintended radiological exposure to friendly units, and helicopters needing intimate knowledge of the weather to avoid dust and radiation. But as with the Army, experience with actual atomic blasts didn't stop the Marines from evolving with nuclear war as its premise. Things really started moving in April of 1956 when a Fleet Marine Force Organization and Composition Board was formed to make force structure reflect the new doctrine. It was chaired by Major General Robert E. Hogaboom, what a name, and produced their report in December of 1956. The Hogaboom Board had to meet a few basic requirements. First, the Marine Division had to excel in conducting amphibious assaults against modern defenses. This was the North Star and couldn't be compromised. Second, they had to be organized in accordance with their new doctrine. In effect, this resulted in similar guiding principles as the Army's very different execution, that being the ability to fight dispersed and semi-independently, which required helicopter mobility as per Marine thinking. They'd also increase the unit's recon and security capabilities, because when units are highly dispersed, security becomes a much bigger challenge. Third, the division had to be strategically mobile. This not only meant shipping economy or deck space, but also keeping the weight of individual platforms down to be air transportable. Fourth, combat elements had to shed as much logistics as possible. This would allow the infantry regiments to be carried entirely by helicopters, with heavy support and logistics available for attachment from the force troops only when needed. And fifth, the division had to easily create temporary task groups. In response to those 5 points, the board came up with the Marine Division that was familiar but had a bunch of changes under the hood. To make this a proper comparison, I'll start with the division they replaced. The so-called K-Series Marine Division was what they took into Korea. Its wartime configuration consisted of 21,210 Marines and 1,145 sailors. They were divided into 3 infantry regiments, an artillery regiment, and 9 separate battalions, including headquarters, tank, engineer, signal, medical, service, motor transport, shore party, and ordnance battalions. The infantry regiments consisted of an H&S company, mortar company, anti-tank company, and 3 infantry battalions. The artillery regiment supporting them had an HQ battery, service battery, 3 105mm howitzer battalions for direct support of each regimental combat team, and 1 155mm howitzer battalion for general support of the entire division. Post-Korea, there was a minor update to the K-Series TO&Es implementing lessons learned from the war. A board headed by Major General Thomas Wernham made recommendations that would become the L-Series tables towards the end of 1953. For example, in 1954, the Service Battalion and Ordnance Battalion were consolidated into a 4-company service regiment, centralizing some elements of other battalions. I don't have the full L-Series TO&E, but after looking through several dozen editions of the Camp Lejeune newspaper, the Divisional Signal Battalion stopped getting mentioned around the time the L-Series was introduced. 3 years later, the Provisional Hogaboom reorg began in spring of 1957 with the 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton. First, there was a significant lightening of the division's motor pool. The division would be stripped of anything heavier than a 2.5-ton truck or Ontos tank destroyer, and infantry regiments would get 87 quarter-ton jeeps, including the light aluminum M422 Mighty Mite jeeps, and 90 M274 mechanical mules for cargo and weapons carrying, a rare cute little guy club double feature. It was said that each infantry battalion's 30 mules had 80% the payload capacity, but only 27% the physical weight of the L-Series battalion, which had 7 3/4-ton trucks and trailers, 2 deuce-and-a-half trucks, and 2 water trailers. To demonstrate their air mobility, the CH-37 Mojave could carry 3 Mighty Mites internally. There's also the side benefit of more smaller vehicles allowing for more dispersed logistics. The mechanical mules could get up close to the front line and deliver directly to each rifle company, whereas fewer larger vehicles would have to make the rounds to each company sequentially. Mechanical mules were also easier to hide than a deuce-and-a-half, reducing a risk of observation. Organizationally, the divisions also shedded some of its heavy capabilities to the force troops. That way, they'd become reinforcements when needed, rather than burdening the division at all times. First, the Divisional Tank Battalion was moved to the force troops, and the regimental anti-tank companies were consolidated as a Divisional Anti-Tank Battalion with 45 M50 Ontoses. Ontoses? Ontai? Whatever. Each vehicle was armed with 6 M40 recoilless rifles. The Ontos wasn't meant to be an armored spearhead like the medium tanks, but they were meant to destroy hostile tanks and other armored vehicles, or provide direct fire support to infantry and recon patrols as a secondary mission. The Ontos could be transported by an R4Q flying boxcar, satisfying the division level requirement for air transportability. But a more pressing issue was with the technology of the time. It was believed that tanks were not especially effective during night engagements and low visibility conditions. This was a big issue because it was envisioned that most offensive operations would take place at night to avoid getting nuked, so it was acceptable that the tank battalion could become a sum-of-the-time attachment. This also allowed the division to shed much of the logistics and engineer bridging support that was required to support tanks to the force troops. The division's engineer battalion was thus renamed a Pioneer Battalion to draw a distinction between it and the Force Engineer Battalion. It had the ability to attach 1 Pioneer company to each regimental landing team and maintain a Pioneer support company with construction and bridging capability in the division rear area. Logistically, the Service Regiment and Shore Party Battalion were consolidated into a single service battalion. The new battalion consisted of an H&S company, 3 light support companies, a medium support company, and 2 landing support companies. The light support companies would support each regimental landing team, while the medium support company was a general support outfit for the entire division. Each company was multifunctional, half supply and half maintenance elements. The landing support company, meanwhile, had the shore party function of controlling beach operations. In the headquarters battalion, radio capacity was increased and wire laying capabilities were reduced. The division headquarters itself was also reorganized to allow it to man a main, alternate, and administrative command post. The redundancy was necessary to maintain continuity of command in case the main CP got nuked. The Divisional Recon Company was also replaced by a Recon Battalion, reflective of the need for greater intel gathering and security capabilities in a highly dispersed battlefield. Better target acquisition to effectively use nuclear weapons was also a concern. Now, onto the main combat power of the division, the Infantry Regiment. The biggest change on the tin was in the Infantry Battalion. Going from 1 H&S company, 3 rifle companies, and 1 weapons company, to 4 rifle companies and no weapons company. The individual platoons from the old weapons company were moved to the H&S company, as weapons wasn't intended to be employed as a whole company anyway. Each rifle company was also 34 men smaller, although they didn't compromise on a few things. Each company still had 9 13-man rifle squads, 3 2-gun machine gun sections, 1 per platoon, and 2 assault squads, each with 2 bazookas. They even later increased that to 3 assault squads, 1 per rifle platoon. Manpower savings mainly came from removing the 60mm mortar section and reducing the number of ammo bearers in each machine gun squad from 5 to 2. The Marines believed that the 60mm suffered from lackluster performance during the Korean War, so its removal was a matter of course, and they thought that the increased lethality of the 106mm recoilless rifles could make up for it. Although, as Vietnam showed, the flat trajectory nature of rocket launchers would not be sufficient to clear out an entrenched enemy. As for the machine guns, it was thought that increased resupply frequency granted by helicopters would compensate for fewer ammo bearers. Rifle platoons were basically unchanged though. The addition of a 4th rifle company was intended to increase the battalion's flexibility for reasons similar to the US Army's adoption of 4 to 5 company battle groups. Dispersion was necessary during nuclear combat to avoid presenting targets. Infantry battalions might have to operate semi-independently with open flanks. Going to 4 rifle companies allowed battalion commanders to maintain a substantial reserve while still maintaining 2 companies on the line. It was specifically noted that the 4th Rifle Company shouldn't just be used to increase the battalion's frontage, although that often happens in real life. The 4th Company also provided more men to maintain flank and rear security, provide security to non-helicopter mobile attachments like ONTOS or tank units, or units awaiting a lift, and allow the battalion to sustain combat longer by cycling worn-out companies off the front line. They could also be specially trained to conduct reconnaissance missions, in which case the battalion would be laid out as 2 companies up, 1 company in reserve, and 1 company doing R&S. Going to 4 rifle companies was arguably the least controversial idea of the whole program, and served the Marines well during Vietnam. At the higher levels, battalion H&S companies grew from 204 men to 359, while the regimental H&S was redesignated as an HQ company and reduced from 249 to 155. The reason for these changes was to make the battalions more independent. Much of the administration and logistics once the regiment's responsibility was transferred to the battalions or sent up to the division. In this way, the battalion was really a semi-independent fighting unit capable of its own admin, while the regimental HQ became a purely tactical fighting headquarters. The regiment could accept any combination of battalions from other regiments, and because the battalions contained their own admin, there wouldn't be as many awkward slices of support from unrelated units. The regiment was further simplified and lightened by centralizing the ONTOS anti-tank companies in that divisional battalion and centralizing the 4.2-inch mortars in the Artillery Regiment. The artillery saw much greater change than the infantry, both in equipment and their concept of operation, and also probably the greatest backtracking. Under the provisional model, the 3 105mm howitzer battalions were replaced by 3 close support battalions armed with heavy mortars. 24 4.2-inch or 107mm mortars would replace the battalion's 18 105mm howitzers. This coincided with the shutting down of the L-Series Infantry Regiment's 4.2-inch mortar company, which had 12 tubes. As each of the lighter artillery battalions would directly support each regimental landing team, this means the RLT's heavier indirect fire support went from 18 105s and 12 4 deuces to just 24 4 deuces. At the time, they intended to replace the 4 deuces with a lightweight 105 or 120mm mortar in the indeterminate future, something the Marines wouldn't get until the 2000s with the M327 120mm. What did happen though was they put an M30 4.2-inch mortar on a 75mm pack howitzer carriage and called it an M98 Howtar, which was issued to the 11th Marines in October of 1960 and saw service in Vietnam. This increased its mobility, stability, and accuracy, made it quicker to emplace, but didn't put it on par with 105s in terms of range or destructive capability. The 155mm howitzer battalion meanwhile would be replaced by a 24-gun 105mm intermediate support battalion. Heavier stuff like self-propelled 155mm howitzers, 8-inch howitzers, and Honest John nuclear-capable rockets would be part of the Force Artillery Group, basically equivalent to the Army's Corps Artillery. Under the new model, each artillery battery directly supporting a regiment needed to be helo assault capable, and all of them needed to be capable of operating as an independent task force. Essentially, each battery would be given its own supply, maintenance, forward observation, fire data preparation, and communications subunits. The Battalion Fire Direction Center would be primarily responsible for massing the fire of multiple batteries and directing counter-mortar fire, but the battery became the basic unit. With batteries as their own self-contained modules, battalions could in theory easily absorb attached to batteries without having to slice up the logistics units supporting them. As well, because the batteries would be responsible for generating their own platform-specific firing data, the battalion could control up to 6 firing units of any caliber, including the heavier force artillery. It also facilitated a battery attached directly to an infantry battalion independent of the artillery battalion, as would be common for battalion landing teams. In terms of operation, close support battalions would co-locate one battery command post and fire direction center at each infantry battalion CP. Each battery also had 4 forward observation sections, enough for 1 per rifle company. These 2 elements constituted the battery HQ, while the firing platoons and logistics elements were contained within the firing battery. Further, the organization of the mortar batteries into 2 firing platoons, each with its own fire direction center, allowed for the battery to engage 2 targets simultaneously along the infantry battalion's front or provide continuous coverage when leapfrogging mortar platoons. As far as close air support and naval gunfire coordination, the close support battalion's HQ battery gained a naval gunfire liaison team and 2 shore fire control parties. Previously, the Infantry Regiment H&S Company would have one of the former, while the Infantry Battalion H&S Company would have one of the latter. While technically a reduction in parties, it was reasoned that Marines may be out of range of naval gunfire much of the time. It was also believed that nuking beach defenses would be a viable tactic, which would further reduce the need for naval gunfire support. If more parties were needed, they could be attached from an artillery battalion not using theirs, but they could otherwise be used as additional forward observers. By contrast, infantry battalion TAC-P sections grew in size to accommodate 1 air liaison party and 2 forward air controller or FAC parties instead of just 1. This increase reflected the heightened importance of close air support on the modern battlefield. Overall, the new provisional division would consist of 18,910 Marines, split into 3 infantry regiments, an artillery regiment, and 7 separate battalions, including headquarters, recon, pioneer, ontos, service, medical, and a motor transport battalion. Compared to a US Army Pentomic division, it had about 5,000 more personnel, but was substantially lighter. The Provisional Marine Division lacked tanks, artillery heavier than 105mm howitzers, or any trucks heavier than a deuce and a half, although those things were available for attachment. The Army had also replaced their 3-regiment structure with one based on 5 battle groups. These were regiment equivalents, but in reality more the size of large battalions, with 4 to 5 rifle companies and a mortar battery or combat support company depending on the type. Their idea was that the division would disperse its battle groups to present a small nuclear target and reconcentrate for combat. However, while this concept on paper called for high mobility, Pentomic divisions did not have the aviation or personnel carriers to back it up. The Marine approach made less radical organizational change, basically just tweaking the original triangular structure with more emphasis on task forces and self-sufficiency. But they were more ready to embrace the helicopter early on, which was one of the big failings of Pentomic. The helicopter, of course, would go on to define the Army in the 60s anyway. Ultimately though, while opinions of the Marines' Provisional Division were positive, it had issues. There was a substantial amount of revision before formal adoption as the M-Series organization before deploying to Vietnam. Except in the Infantry Regiment, that was considered good to go as is. Infantry battalions went on to retain 4 rifle companies until 1979, when the 4th company was replaced by a weapons company. That wasn't for any tactical purpose though, it was to reduce manpower in the face of budget cuts. The Marines even tried to implement a 4 rifle and 1 weapons company structure in the late 80s with 8 of 24 battalions. Basically, battalions preparing to deploy as part of a MU would switch to 4 rifle companies while everyone else had 3. Further, during operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, weapons companies would often be converted into rifle companies ad hoc to make a 4-company battalion. The US Army even actually went to 4-company battalions mid-Vietnam during an emergency reorganization, something the Marines didn't have to do. So I think it's safe to say that 4 rifle companies per battalion was one of the Hogaboom Board's most timeless recommendations. However, in Vietnam, some problems emerged. The Hogaboom Board had turned infantry regiments into purely tactical headquarters with little concern for logistics and administration. This was to make it easy for them to create task forces using battalions from any regiment. Task forces were a double-edged sword though. It was found during Vietnam that the Marine infantry lacked unit cohesion because battalions were swapped between regiments constantly. This left little time to build relationships. One 3rd Marine Division regimental commander described regiments as warlords commanding roving bands of mercenaries. But this was less about regiment structure and more about reining in task organization. When Major General Raymond Davis took command of the 3rd Marine Division in 1968, he reinstituted unit cohesion, so regiments would largely fight with organic battalions. In 1967, a 60mm mortar section was also added back into the Rifle Company weapons platoon. This was a response to Vietnamese hugging tactics, which required light indirect fire to counter when they got inside the American artillery and CAS bubble. But otherwise, revisions to the infantry structure were minimal. By contrast, the Artillery Regiment ended up significantly different from the Hogaboom Board's initial recommendation. The close and intermediate support battalions were renamed as the more typical direct and general support battalions, and rather than going all in on heavy mortars, the direct support battalions became 3 M101 105mm howitzer batteries with 6 guns each, and 1 Howtar battery with 6 tubes as well. By the mid-60s, technology had progressed to the point where newly introduced CH-53 and CH-46 helicopters could lift the 105s, so the direct support battalions were still congruent with the helo assault concept. The 4th General Support Battalion, meanwhile, would fight as 3 batteries of 6 155s, initially the old M114 Alphas and then self-propelled M109s. There were also some changes in logistics. The Shore Party Battalion was reactivated and made organic to the division again in 1964. During Vietnam, the battalion would deploy a company to each infantry regiment, with landing zone control teams integrated down to the rifle company level. While the Shore Party units were originally meant for controlling men and materiel across a beach, they became very useful in the helicopter age. The Pioneer Battalion was also renamed the Engineer Battalion once more. Other than that though, this was basically the standard division when the US entered Vietnam. Of course, things became more complicated with the attachment of force troops during that war. Using the 1st Marine Division as an example, ignoring the fact that infantry and artillery regiments were severely task organized, it received the following units as attachments: the 1st Tank Battalion, 3rd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, 11th Motor Transport Battalion, 7th Communications Battalion, and 7th and 9th Engineer Battalions. The Divisional Service Battalions were also detached to the Force Logistics Command, which provided logistics to all Marine units in country. Further, in December of 1967, the Yantos Battalions were reduced to reinforced 20-vehicle companies and attached to the Tank Battalions. But it wouldn't be until the late 70s or early 80s that tanks and amphibian tractors were formally moved from the force troops back to the Marine divisions. So now that you have an idea of how the Marines reorganized, where did they succeed, where the Army failed? In reality, the Marines made some of the mistakes that the Army made, but at the end of the day, the Marine Division was more generalizable to conventional conflict with the technology and tactics of the time. It turned out that helicopters and amphibious warfare was a good call, and Marine air-ground task forces have been embarked aboard flat-top ships with significant aviation components ever since. Today, with the vast distances of the Pacific and precision-guided weapons, dispersion to avoid detection and targeting is on everyone's minds, and many of the principles of avoiding nukes carry over. The fact that modern Marine formations like MEUs and Marine Expeditionary Brigades are task-organized formations also proves the point that rapidly creating task groups was a prescient requirement. Army Pentomic battle groups, because of lacking mobility, were keyholed into a mostly static posture, overly reliant on tactical nuclear fire support to survive. A Marine unit might have found itself as unlucky as a Pentomic unit if a nuclear war occurred, but when the Kennedy administration's flexible response doctrine came down, conventional wars came back into the conversation. The Army had to change its approach. They adopted a brigade-based system, but the Marines didn't. The first regiment-on-regiment engagement of the Vietnam War fought by American troops was a textbook two-prong amphibious attack carried out by Marines. In August of 1965, Operation Starlight aimed at spoiling an anticipated Viet Cong attack against Chu Lai Air Base. It involved Marine Regimental Landing Team 7 in command of 3 battalions. The night before the operation, Company M, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines set up a blocking position on the Tra Bong River between Chu Lai and the enemy. 3 of the 4 rifle companies from 2nd Battalion 4th Marines conducted a helicopter assault from Chu Lai, hitting 3 landing zones to the west in 4 waves. They were carried by 26 UH-34 helicopters manned by the 261st and 361st Marine Medium Helicopter Squadrons. The balance of 3rd Battalion 3rd Marines, meanwhile, landed amphibiously near Angong, reinforced with tanks and LVTs. And finally, as the regimental reserve was 3rd Battalion's 7th Marines. The 7th Fleet's Special Landing Force, which was basically a MEU equivalent, called in for the operation. It was inserted beginning on D-Day to reinforce 3 Marines in heavy contact. While the helicopter assault element ran into classic airborne problems, i.e. landing surrounded and in contact, the operation was considered a success. So the first big battle involving American troops was one using more or less the principles espoused by the Hogaboom Board. Span of control-wise, the Marine Division was triangular, except in infantry battalions where the 4th Rifle Company was probably worth it, so it remained manageable. Under the Pentomic Army, the division level had 5 maneuver subunits, not including the tank battalion, plus a ton of other combat support, which pushed the limits of manageability. The Pentomic Division did have a brigade headquarters subordinate to the division HQ to take control of 2 or more battle groups, and a senior battle group commander could command a task force with more than 1, but it was still questionable. At the battle group level, early airborne and later D-series infantry battle groups had 5 rifle companies plus a combat support company or mortar battery, so span of control was also worse than in the Marine Infantry Battalion. Aviation also wasn't as thoroughly developed in US Army divisions while Pentomic was still in effect, which was a big issue for a division predicated on mobility. As far as transportation, the Pentomic Infantry Division before 1960 only had 8 H-19 Chickasaw utility helicopters and 6 L-20 Beaver utility airplanes. Assuming a realistic aircraft availability of 75% left a single-lift transport capacity of about 60 men by helicopter and 16 men by airplane, so basically a platoon and a half. Airborne divisions had a little more transportation, with 20 utility helicopters and 6 utility airplanes, but that was still only 200 men by helicopter and 24 men by plane, being generous with 100% availability, probably more like 150 and 16 men in a realistic scenario, so less than a rifle company. When the refined D-Series Infantry Division went into effect from 1959 to 1960, transport capability increased to 4 L-20 Beavers, 6 larger H-21 Shawnee or H-34 Choctaw light transport helicopters, and 4 H-19s. If we're being generous, up to 112 to 160 men by helicopter, still not enough to transport an entire rifle company. By contrast, the Hogaboom Board recommendation called for the division's paired air wing to have 2 medium and 2 light helicopter transport squadrons, in addition to a helicopter recon squadron aligned to the division recon battalion and all the other fixed-wing squadrons. Just accounting for transportation helicopters, excluding observation like I did with the Army, this would have meant 60 UH-34 Seahorse-type helicopters and 30 CH-37 Mojaves. This force would have been able to transport a battalion landing team in one lift with 100% availability. Even at 75% availability, you're talking about maybe 1,100 Marines, basically an entire unreinforced infantry battalion. You'd probably only get part of that when factoring in heavy equipment, other cargo, and attached support units, but it's still a lot better than 1.5 platoons. Ancillary to the tactical problems, the Marine solution also didn't result in a major shakeup of career progressions. Captains commanded companies, lieutenant colonels battalions, and colonels regiments. But the Army solution created a void between captain company commanders and colonel battle group commanders. No command positions for all those lieutenant colonels 15-20 years into their career, at least in the light infantry. Lieutenant colonel unemployment led to the D-series battle groups having 2 of them. One as a deputy commander, and one as a somewhat redundant executive officer. So while the division needed more colonels to command fewer men, 2 lieutenant colonels were left doing the work of 1 major. But for all the Marines had going for them, some things didn't stand the test of time. Both the Hogaboom Marine Division and the original Pentomic divisions either didn't have enough artillery or had the wrong kind. In the Army's case, they had to add 4 additional artillery battalions to each division in the D-Series update. Each battle group would get a kind of weird direct support battalion with a 1 105 and 1 155 battery rather than just 1 105 battery that they had originally. In the Marines' case, they walked back the lightning of their artillery in favor of a more conventional 105-155 howitzer team, although the structure itself was sound. The advancement of both helicopter and howitzer technology also made helicopter transport of towed 155s viable, which to be fair to the Hogaboom Board wasn't the case in the 50s. The Marines also ultimately allowed their divisions to get heavier, with the general support artillery battalions being re-equipped with self-propelled artillery. The tanks and amphibians technically remained force troops, but by the 80s, those battalions were reintegrated into the divisions. Still, while Marine divisions kept evolving, they didn't suffer the neck-breaking changes the Army did in going from triangular divisions to Pentomic to revised D-Series Pentomic to Road, especially in infantry units. If you appreciate this kind of obscure organizational info that only nerds like me care about, I'd really appreciate if you consider joining my Patreon. My patrons make it so I can always spend time making niche videos even if they don't have mass appeal, and they also get access to my patrons Discord where I post all my works in progress and talk about this kind of stuff if that's something you're into. But if you just want to binge more Atomic Age content, check out this playlist with all the wacky stuff militaries were doing around that time. I'll see you over there.